Hi, my name is John Giuliano.
John, here we are in Chalatenango at the cemetery, and you've brought me here a number of times to tell a story that I really appreciate you telling the audience.
So we're at the cemetery here in Chalatenango, where the Knoll sisters are buried. And here there are actually 3 sisters that are here: Ida Ford, Maura Clark, and Carla Pete. And Carla was murdered, or actually she drowned outside of Guajira in 1980, August of that year, in a flash flood. And actually saving Ida Ford, she actually pushed Ida out of the window of the Jeep, and while she did that, she drowned. And then of course Mara and Ida, along with Dorothy Kazel and Jean Donovan, were murdered by the National Guard of El Salvador. And why it's such an important story, because it was really the first time that for a lot of people that they heard about the war in El Salvador. Like, people had no idea what was going on. And then all of a sudden, on days after this murder, on December 2nd, 1980, there was Ambassador Robert White with now a very famous photograph of when they found the women's bodies in the ground, and the shock of in El Salvador they kill priests, they kill civilians, they kill poor people, and now they even kill Catholic sisters. And what kind of makes the story important is this, because now for the first time the United States had responsibility too. Like, it just wasn't people that had been killed somewhere else, but these were North American women. And I'll tell the story about Jean Donovan, who's not buried here. And the Knolls are buried here because it's the Knoll tradition inside of their order as religious women, that they're buried where they're in mission. So if they die on their mission, that's why they're buried here. But Jean Donovan was a woman. I'm looking at all these young guys that are here filming us right now. She was, definitely upper middle class kid. Grew up, good schools, good Catholic schools. Went to a good college, had the same goals like many kids in the United States, get a good job, buy things. And that was her life, She became an accountant. She bought an apartment in Cleveland on the lake. She got herself a Harley Davidson motorcycle, and apparently she drank a lot of beer. And I always appreciate that, Guinness, I think, was her beer of choice. And then of course she went to hear a Knoll priest speak about the work of the Knoll order, and he began talking about El Salvador. And at that point, El Salvador was a country in crisis, and where poor people were being assassinated almost daily by paramilitary organizations, governmental military. And Romero, who was the archbishop, they began killing priests. And it was interesting that it was the Catholic religion, this thing they call liberation theology, that put many of these people in danger. And liberation theology was understanding the world from a perspective of the victim. Like, why is it in Latin America, a country that is so Catholic, why do people suffer so much? Why do people are forced to live in extreme poverty? Why can't unions organize? Why isn't there education? Why isn't there adequate housing? You know, these are very real questions. And anyway, the nuns came, and Jean heard that story and says, I want to go to El Salvador. So eventually she came and she hooked up with Maura and Ida and Dorothy Kazel, this team of women. And they were going to go work where I work, in a place called Gorgila. And they were going to teach catechism and education and literacy. And then eventually their work would change as the military began blowing up the countryside. These women's position became to drive refugees at an emergency basis out of this zone into safety to San Salvador. And at that point, the Archbishop had opened up churches, as they called them, refugios, where people that were being bombed out on were able to have the safety, of the Catholic Church. So these women began driving refugees out of this bombed out zone into San Salvador. And that was their job, and they drove around in this big white van. And Jean at one point called themselves the God Squad, where she was able to actually negotiate with military people at roadside checkpoints, and liberate, so many of these people that were being questioned by the military. And then it was in El Salvador, if they said they were going to kill you, they'll kill you. So eventually, this date, December 2nd, Maura Clark and Ida Ford had gone to this meeting in Nicaragua, and Dorothy Kazel and Jean Donovan had the job of picking them up at the airport. And when they got to the airport, they got in the van and they drove away. And then miles from where you came in at the airport, their van was intercepted by 6 National Guardsmen, and they drove them off this road not too far from the airport, where 2 of the women were raped, while the others at gunpoint were forced to watch them. And all 4 of them were executed and thrown in a hole. And I think really what this tomb used to say, that here are the blood of these women will be the ferment of the new society. And really what happened here, and why this is important, because for the first time, North American people, mostly women, they filled up airplanes. And when they killed these women, these North American women would come to El Salvador and say they wanted to know the truth of what was happening here in El Salvador. They wanted to know why these women were murdered by the military. They wanted to know why that civilians were being subjected to undiscriminated bombing. They wanted to know why there was this injustice in El Salvador. And mostly they wanted to know why these North American women, why the United States was spending all this money in a war in Central America that was killing women, that was killing children, that was killing priests. And that's really where you see this idea of, of resurrection, and we mentioned that this cemetery is very, very different. And in Latin America or in the United States, we almost want to pretend that this part of our life doesn't exist. We're not going to waste our time on death. But in El Salvador, we're constantly reminded of death. And And really, you see the bright colors all around us in the cemetery because we know this is not the end. And even in Catholic tradition, we celebrate the day of our death as this beginning. So in a sense, when these women were killed, you know, their blood really becomes sort of the calling cry for so many people in North America that said, this isn't acceptable to us anymore. And literally the solidarity movement in the United States, which would eventually end the Salvadoran War 12 years later, really begins here. So if we could choose one site, one place as North Americans, you know, we come here and realize that this really was this whole new generation of women and a whole new generation of religious that began to see their responsibility in the world in a very unique way, and that these women as martyrs have done so much to help us really understand the great lie, which is war, you know, and certainly the great lie, which was the Salvadoran War, you know. And so I was the generation that followed these women, and what an honor, you know, what an honor to be able to share this story here with you today. But for those of us that are inspired, you know, Anita Ford, I mean, they lived in Chile prior to El Salvador, but they always talked about wanting to do something great for God, you know, and I mean that sort of heroic desire, you know, to do something great for God is really what we lack now. It's the element that we lack in our imagination as we imagine this new world, but we don't imagine very heroic acts of love like this one. And then lastly, this is really about relationships. Like, these women were not killed because they had decided that international communism or capitalism was right or wrong. They came here to be in relationship to the men and women, and mostly children, you know. But it's relationships that really inspire us to change the world. It was really love that these women had for these people that they had met in El Salvador. And we'll talk today, we'll talk about Romero, we'll talk about the Jesuits. It could be a little different too, but here there really was a relationship with these people in those communities. There really was love. And ultimately, you know, that is the ultimate of revolutionary acts, right? Love really is the only revolution. Everything else is sort of bad copies of something else, but love is, and especially the kind of love that we see in Ida and in Mara and in Jean and in Dorothy was one without, you know, and St. Ignatius talks about giving without counting the cost. This was certainly giving without counting the cost. It wasn't like, I will love you, but this is what you're going to have to do for me. You know, no, these women were like, I'm going to do something. I'm going to love these people. And again, it's interesting and a question that we need to ask. If the message of these women as Catholic Church was so threatening that they needed to kill them, put bullets in their bodies, really, why is that message so dangerous? And we'll ask that question throughout the day, you know, why? But I think when we think about the Mary Knolls, you know, and this whole story, it really should be about love. It should be about inspiring love. And ultimately, I think that's, the Tamara Foundation just continues in the same, in Spanish we say línea, you know, the same line from these women, you know, in a sense, my big sisters, not to sound, to put myself in their category, but they're certainly my big sisters in the sense that, yeah, it's about You go somewhere and you don't think about what you've lost, but you just keep embracing what you gain, you know, and that's what really this story is about.
Just a little bit on their devotion, their unconditional love for the people they met in this country, those unintended consequences of scaring the military. I mean, enough to order their death, but also the impact on the international community, because you were saying,
well, so
this brought attention to North America, and maybe you could talk just a little bit more about that.
So wars like the wars in El Salvador in the early 80s were very effective because of the lack of social media. Okay, I mean, there were massacres that occurred here that no one knew about, you know, that we're just learning about, and I think that one of the things about when the nuns came here, all of a sudden, look, the source of the violence came from the United States. Someone paid for that. And all the weapons in this country came from the United States. And that's just a fact. And it was paid for by the United States. So we have great responsibility in that, you know? And I think when the nuns came, certainly their circle of friends, you know, their religious congregations, they became very interested in what these nuns were about. And consequently, they became witnesses to war. And they were able to tell the world what was going on here, you know, and fact, presidents do lie. Fact, governments do lie. Fact, this war was lied about forever. And it was one constant justification after another. And what the Maryknolls, when they were murdered, congregations of women would come, and we would laugh because so many of these women were the old nuns, you know, that it didn't even stand 5 feet tall. And there they were underneath the shadow of these very large men in weapons. And they were absolutely fearless. And they said, we want to know why our sisters were killed. And of course, they only had so many lies about why their sisters were killed. You know, these sisters stood in the way of a narrative that was very profitable. War was very profitable. And here are these women saying, wait a minute, you know, people are profiting off the murder of children, off of women, off of elderly. And those are the women that they buried before they were actually buried. So, I mean, I don't know if I answered the question very well, but I mean, their story began, people started coming here, just like we are right now, and now we're doing it virtually because people can't physically come here. But these stories are really, really important. And when someone tells you justifying war, maybe there's another truth. And I was here. I was here during that war. I was a witness to that war. I heard those lies. I saw the results. And I also saw what happens when organized people leave places like this and go back to their own country, and they say, what a waste, you're wasting your money. That country, they're profiting from violence or corruption. But people can go and tell the story, and really that's really what the Acts of the Apostles was all about, right? Telling the stories and how important for people to come, and the responsibility of, and people that actually even hear a video like this, you now have a responsibility to be witnesses to war and injustice and say something and actually do something, you know. And for some of you, it may be to come to a place like El Salvador, you know. And for others, it's writing your congresswoman, you know, or going to a march, or donating to the Tom Bruno Foundation or some other organization that is actively involved in changing people's realities. So this is a really inspiring place, you know. And I remember one time I came here and we were surrounded by military, and they had permit us to come in here. And this old nun, she said, and she did it in this way, and I thought it was very funny, but I'll end it this way. She says, and we pray to Ita, and we pray to Mora, and we pray to Carla, and we pray to Jean, you know, invoking these names, right? And yeah, so what a wonderful place to invoke these names, you know, and hopefully they're going to help us, guide us into the future as we look at gang violence, as we address ignorance, as we address another corrupt government in El Salvador, you know, as we address politicians entertaining violence, you know. This is what this is about. So, anyway.